In the late 6th century, the kingdoms of the Franks were divided, not only by land, but by blood, betrayal, and ambition. The Merovingian dynasty, infamous for its tangled lineages and violent feuds, was no stranger to political warfare. But amidst this chaos, one woman would rise to become a queen, a regent, a feared ruler, and ultimately, the victim of one of the most grotesque executions in royal history. Her name was Brunhilda. Brunhilda was not born into the Frankish world. She was a Visigoth, a princess of Spain, the daughter of King Athanagild. She was raised in the sun-washed courts of Toledo, educated in Roman law, fluent in Latin and Greek, and steeped in the customs of the Christian aristocracy. At a time when most royal women were married off like cattle to forged alliances, Brunhilda stood apart, intelligent, literate, and politically astute. Her marriage would not be the end of her power. It would be its beginning. In the year 567, she was offered in marriage to Sigebert I, king of Austrasia, one of the divided realms of the Frankish Empire. Sigebert was in bitter competition with his half-brother Chilperic I, who ruled Neustria. Where Sigebert was considered noble and measured, Chilperic was cruel, erratic, and known for his brutal ambition. When Sigebert took the refined and regal Brunhilda as his queen, Chilperic responded in typical fashion by marrying her sister Galswintha, only to have her strangled shortly after. The murder of Galswintha wasn't merely a family scandal. It was a spark in dry kindling. Brunhilda, furious and grief-stricken, swore vengeance. The Frankish court now became a bloody chessboard, and Brunhilda, one of its most cunning players. As Queen of Austrasia, Brunhilda took an active role in governance. She advised Sigebert on state affairs, helped standardize legal systems, and worked to curtail the growing power of the nobility. Her presence at court was not ornamental. It was forceful, but her influence made her enemies, particularly among the Frankish aristocrats who resented a foreign-born queen wielding such control. Then, in 575, everything changed. Sigebert was assassinated, stabbed in the gut by agents believed to be working for Chilperic. The murder was public. It was brutal, and it left Brunhilda widowed and vulnerable. She was swiftly captured by Chilperic and imprisoned in Rouen. But her story did not end in a cell. Far from it. While under confinement, Brunhilda began to rebuild. She seduced Merovec, Chilperic's son from an earlier marriage, and married him. Perhaps out of strategy, perhaps out of necessity. The union was scandalous. It enraged Chilperic. He had the marriage annulled and Merovec exiled. Brunhilda was cast out once again, but she would not vanish. By 584, Chilperic himself was dead, assassinated in a dark corridor, his wife Fredegund suspected but never proven guilty. A power vacuum formed in Neustria. Brunhilda returned to Austrasia, and with her young son Childebert II crowned as king, she assumed the role of regent. Her reign behind the throne would shape the Frankish kingdoms for decades to come. From this moment on, Brunhilda became more than a queen mother. She became a sovereign in her own right. She negotiated with emperors, declared war on rival kingdoms, built roads and infrastructure, and worked tirelessly to maintain power through generations of shifting alliances. But her rise, as impressive as it was, left behind a long trail of enemies. Nobles she had punished, bishops she had humiliated, families she had displaced. And chief among her rivals was the ghost of Galswintha and the woman who had replaced her, Fredegund. The feud between Brunhilda and Fredegund would become legendary. It was not simply a quarrel between queens. It was a war fought through assassinations, poisoned letters, kidnapped heirs, and full-blown battles. Their mutual hatred would spill across decades and generations, consuming their children and grandchildren in a bloody dance for power. Brunhilda's story was only beginning, but already it was steeped in betrayal, political cunning, and revenge. The noble-born princess from Toledo had become a formidable ruler of the Franks. Yet the crown she wore came at a terrible cost, and the enemies she made would one day come back not with swords, but with swine. Her fate was sealed not by war or age, but by a punishment so vile, it blurred the line between myth and reality. The pigs were waiting. But not yet. By the time Brunhilda assumed regency over Austrasia in the name of her young son Childebert II, The Frankish kingdoms were already fractured by years of fraternal strife. The death of Sigebert, I had left Austrasia fragile, and the assassination of Chilperic, I opened a fresh wound in Neustria. Amid this disarray, Brunhilda found herself not merely defending a throne, but caught in a relentless web of dynastic war. At the heart of it all lay blood, royal blood, spilled in the name of power. The Merovingian dynasty was notorious for its violent infighting. Instead of passing a unified kingdom from father to son, Merovingian kings divided their lands among multiple heirs. This practice ensured civil war was never far behind. Siblings became rivals. Nephews became threats. Assassinations were not aberrations. They were expected. Childebert II, Brunhilda's son, was still a child when he inherited the crown. Brunhilda became his guardian, mentor, and the true ruler of Austrasia. Under her control, the realm found a strange semblance of order. Roads were repaired. Roman laws were revived. Bishops were appointed and removed with swift calculation. For a time, it appeared Brunhilda was steering Austrasia toward stability. But peace was fleeting. Power attracts enemies, and Brunhilda's uncompromising leadership antagonized many of the Frankish nobles. Unlike the traditional Merovingian queens who held ceremonial roles, Brunhilda sat at the center of governance, and that made her dangerous. In the west, in Neustria, a new regent rose to counter her influence, Fredegund. Fredegund had once been a palace servant, but she had clawed her way into royalty through manipulation and bloodshed. After having Galswintha murdered, she married Chilperic I and bore him a son, Clotaire II. Her ascent had been steep and brutal. While Brunhilda governed through law and lineage, Fredegund ruled through fear and cunning. The hatred between Brunhilda and Fredegund became legendary, not just personal, but political, ideological. Each woman sought to preserve her lineage. Each sought to dominate the Frankish world. Their rivalry wasn't just a footnote in history. It was a prolonged and bloody civil war that consumed everything in its path. Assassins were hired, messengers poisoned, envoys ambushed. Fredegund once tried to have Brunhilda murdered with a dagger hidden beneath a gift. Brunhilda retaliated by launching raids into Neustria, burning villages loyal to her rival. Their vendetta escalated into full-scale war. Caught in this chaos were the sons of these queens, child kings who were raised not as innocent heirs, but as pawns in a matriarchal war. Brunhilda's son Childebert II grew into a sharp and capable ruler under his mother's tutelage. But even as he took the reins of power, he relied heavily on Brunhilda's counsel. The bond between mother and son was tight, too tight for some noble's comfort. They whispered behind closed doors, calling her the Dark Queen, the true sovereign hiding behind a child's crown. Meanwhile, Fredegund's son, Clotaire II, grew under the shadow of his mother's schemes. When Fredegund died in 597, Clotaire inherited Neustria, but with many enemies. He bided his time, waiting for a chance to strike. Then came the greatest blow to Brunhilda, the death of her son Childebert II in 595, at just 26 years old. The cause? Allegedly dysentery. But whispers in the court suggested otherwise. Poison, perhaps. The hand of Fredegund, reaching from the shadows once more. Brunhilda's grief was enormous, but her ambition did not die. She installed her grandsons Theudebert II and Theoderic II as kings of Austrasia and Burgundy, respectively, once again serving as regent. At this point, Brunhilda had outlived two kings, buried one son, and outmaneuvered a dozen plots against her life. Her iron will remain unbroken, but she was now surrounded by distrust. Her grandsons, raised in rival courts, began to resent her influence. One by one, nobles began defecting. Bishops accused her of overreach. Once hailed as a stabilizing force, Brunhilda was now branded a tyrant, especially by the Austrasian nobility, who despised her interference. And in Neustria, Clotaire II watched. Patient, cunning, he had inherited more than his mother's blood. He had inherited her hatred. And soon he would act. The Frankish civil war that began with two sisters, Brunhilda and Galswintha, now reached across 3 generations. What had started as a royal marriage alliance had exploded into decades of slaughter. By now, The line between justice and vengeance had all but disappeared. As war continued to rage, Brunhilda's grasp on the crown began to slip. The nobles whispered louder. Her grandsons drifted further. The church distanced itself. And far away in Neustria, Clotaire sharpened his sword. The queen who had ruled from behind thrones for over 4 decades would soon face the sharp edge of betrayal. Not from her enemies, but from those she once protected. The pigs were still waiting. By the early 600s, Brunhilda stood as one of the most powerful and polarizing figures in the Frankish world. She was no longer just a queen mother or a grieving widow. She was a seasoned stateswoman, a political chess master who had weathered more assassinations, betrayals, and battlefield losses than most kings. Yet with each victory, she carved deeper resentment into the hearts of those around her. As her grandsons took their thrones, Brunhilda tightened her grip on the realm, and that grip would soon become a vice. Theudebert II and Theoderic II, sons of her late son Childebert II, now ruled Austrasia and Burgundy respectively. Their reigns were nominal, for it was Brunhilda who moved the pieces, made the decrees, and punished dissent. Even as the boys matured into men, they remained under her formidable shadow. She managed their courts, chose their advisors, negotiated treaties, and even led their armies at times. To some, she was a guiding light in the chaos of Merovingian politics. To others, she was a thorny tyrant, a foreign woman poisoning the veins of Frankish nobility. It didn't help that her policies were often ruthless. Brunhilda believed in centralizing power. She stripped rebellious nobles of their lands, exiled bishops who spoke against her, and dismissed generals she could not control. Her goal was stability. Her method was domination. This autocratic style alarmed the Austrasian and Burgundian aristocracy, many of whom had long enjoyed relative autonomy under weaker monarchs. Now, under Brunhilda's reign, they were expected to obey or be crushed. But even worse than her severity was her age. By now in her 60s, an extraordinary age of the time, Brunhilda had outlived 3 generations of rulers. Her longevity, instead of being revered, became a liability. Her grandsons began to view her not as a trusted regent, but as an immovable obstacle, clinging to power long past her time. Theoderic II, her younger grandson, remained loyal to her for much of his reign. But Theudebert II, older and more independent, chafed under her command. The relationship between the brothers became tense and competitive, fueled, in no small part, by Brunhilda's attempts to play them against each other. She manipulated their courts, fed their paranoia, and when necessary, incited conflict to maintain her relevance. Some claim she orchestrated battles between them solely to weaken them both and preserve her own authority. Whether true or not, the result was civil war once again, a fraternal feud that further fractured the already bleeding Merovingian realm. But war with family wasn't her only concern. In the west, Clotaire too continued to gather strength. After the death of his mother, Fredegund, Clotaire had managed to consolidate power in Neustria. Though he had been a child when the civil wars began, he had grown into a formidable ruler, and he never forgot the feud his mother had carried against Brunhilda. To Clotaire, Brunhilda represented everything wrong with the Frankish monarchy. She was a Visigoth, a woman, a schemer, a heretic, in the eyes of some churchmen. And most importantly, she was the single greatest obstacle to unifying the Frankish kingdoms under his crown. The church, too, had begun to turn against her. Brunhilda's interference in ecclesiastical appointments angered many bishops, and her habit of exiling or executing churchmen who opposed her painted her as impious, even demonic. Legends would later accuse her of sorcery and devilry, common slanders used against powerful women in the medieval world. In the writings of chroniclers like Fredegar, Brunhilda is transformed from a wise and regal queen into a vengeful harpy. These accounts, of course, were written decades after her death, and mostly by men loyal to Clotaire's line. But their narrative stuck. They painted Brunhilda not as a visionary leader or a survivor of brutal politics, but as a power-hungry witch who brought ruin to all she touched. And yet, Brunhilda endured. She continued to rule, even as her alliances crumbled and her enemies gathered. In 612, Theoderic II, her last loyal grandson, died suddenly, perhaps of dysentery, though some whispered of poison once again. Theudebert, too, had already been defeated and killed. With both brothers dead, their sons, Brunhilda's great-grandchildren, were still infants. This was Brunhilda's final opportunity to preserve her legacy. She crowned the eldest great-grandson, Sigebert II, and once again took up the regency. But this time, the nobility had had enough. A coalition of Austrasian and Burgundian nobles, led by the increasingly ambitious mayor of the palace, Warnekar, betrayed Brunhilda. They opened the gates to Clotaire II, offering him the boy king and Brunhilda in exchange for amnesty and favor. It was the ultimate act of treachery and the culmination of decades of resentment. Brunhilda, now over 70, was seized by Clotaire's forces. Her great-grandsons were murdered almost immediately. Sigebert II, barely old enough to speak, was stabbed and thrown into the river, an heir erased with surgical cruelty. And Brunhilda? She was not granted a swift execution. Not for her. She was a queen of thorns, and the thorns were now turned inward. Her punishment was to be a spectacle, an execution designed to erase not just her life, but her legend. The pigs were no longer waiting. They were being prepared. The Merovingian dynasty was built on blood. But by the time Brunhilda was dragged before Clotaire II, it was clear that the bloodline she had so fiercely protected was nearing extinction. For over 40 years, she had battled kings, nobles, bishops, and even her own kin to ensure her family's dominance. But now, in one sweeping betrayal, it was all undone. The last of her great-grandchildren, the boy king Sigebert II, had been slain. His murder wasn't just political, it was symbolic. It declared to the world that the age of Brunhilda's line was over. Her descendants had ruled Austrasia and Burgundy, fought wars in her name, and shaped Frankish history for nearly a century. But now, their bones were food for the worms, and their names struck from records. The betrayal that led to this tragedy was not swift. It had festered for years. The very nobles whom Brunhilda had once ruled with an iron grip had long awaited their moment. She had confiscated their lands, interfered with their marriages, and cast down their chosen bishops. They resented her not just for her power, but for her refusal to act like a typical queen, silent, submissive, and ceremonial. The mayor of the palace, Warnekar, had once served her loyally, but as the court began to fracture after the deaths of her grandsons, he saw an opportunity. Warnekar met with Clotaire II in secret, promising him Brunhilda's head in exchange for political favor and a return to noble autonomy. Clotaire didn't hesitate. The vendetta that had begun with his mother, Fredegund, had never died. Brunhilda had been the blade behind countless deaths, some of them as kin. And now, the Queen of Thorns had no more sons, no armies, and no leverage. All she had was her legacy. She was captured on the banks of Lake Neuchâtel. Accounts say she did not weep, nor plead for mercy. Her dignity remained intact, even as the noose of vengeance tightened. But Clotaire wanted more than her death. He wanted her erased. He ordered that Brunhilda be subjected to public humiliation and torture before her execution. She was paraded from town to town, an old woman, shackled and filthy, displayed like a captured beast. The once regal queen, who had dined with emperors and dictated the fate of kingdoms, was now spat on by peasants and mocked by her enemies. But Clotaire's revenge was not yet satisfied. In the final days of her life, Brunhilda was subjected to a formal trial, where she was accused of a litany of crimes: the murder of 10 kings, treason against the church, witchcraft, and the corruption of the Frankish realm. It was more theater than justice. Every accusation was a dagger sharpened by decades of resentment. Of course, the charge of witchcraft was a common slander. When women wielded power that threatened the patriarchal order, the easiest tool to justify their downfall was to call them a sorceress. Brunhilda was no different. Her intelligence, her unshakable will, and her refusal to be sidelined all made her a prime target for such accusations. Still, she refused to confess. Even under interrogation and brutal treatment, she never admitted guilt. No record suggests she begged for mercy. In a world of cowards and killers, she met her fate like a queen. The sentence, however, was unlike any issue before. Brunhilda was condemned to a death that blurred the line between human cruelty and medieval legend. She was to be tortured and executed publicly, not by the sword, not by the noose, but in a way designed to erase her humanity. Some versions of the story say she was tied by her arms, hair, and limbs to the tails of wild horses and dragged to death, her body ripped apart in front of the crowd. But others tell an even more grotesque end, that she was cast into a pit of starving pigs, alive, torn apart slowly by their snouts and tusks. The image is almost too horrific to believe, and yet it has endured, whether literal or metaphorical. The image of the queen devoured by pigs became legend. The symbolism was chilling. In the ancient world, pigs were often associated with filth, sin, and consumption. To be devoured by swine was to be made unclean, dishonored, and erased. It was the ultimate punishment for a woman accused of corruption and sorcery. This execution, whether by horses or by hogs, was not simply the end of a person. It was an act of historical violence. It was Clotair's way of saying, she was never queen. She was an abomination. Let her be remembered in horror, not honor. But despite his efforts, Brunhilda was not forgotten. Her name, however twisted, lived on. Chroniclers painted her as a villainess, a schemer, and a sinner. But modern historians have begun to reevaluate her reign. She was a woman who dared to rule in a man's world, and paid the ultimate price for it. Clotaire, too, with his enemies crushed and his kingdom unified, believed he had secured peace. But history, like pigs, has a long memory, and it never forgets the taste of blood. When the dust of dynastic war began to settle and the banners of Austrasia and Burgundy were torn down or repurposed under a new ruler, the last figure left standing was Clotaire too. From the perspective of many Frankish nobles, his triumph marked the end of a nightmare. A queen regent who had reigned for decades through terror, politics, and relentless ambition. But Brunhilda's destruction hadn't been solely the work of a king fueled by revenge. In truth, her downfall was shaped just as much by the silent forces of the church as by the blade of the sword. And among those forces stood the Bishop of Rouen, a man known to history as Arnulf, later canonized as Saint Arnulf of Metz. In Brunhilda's final years, Arnulf represented a powerful intersection of religion and political control. His rise as a spiritual leader mirrored Clotaire's military ascent, and together they would position themselves as the architects of a new order, one without the queen they both loathed. But why did the church fear her so deeply? Brunhilda had long been at odds with ecclesiastical authority. As a queen regent, she appointed and removed bishops with startling frequency. She interfered in matters that were traditionally left to the clergy, asserting royal authority in church lands, refusing to submit her decisions to religious councils, and punishing church leaders who challenged her legitimacy. Her enemies accused her of overreach, of godlessness, of consorting with sorcery. And though she was a devout Christian by upbringing and ritual, her political tactics made her the embodiment of what the Frankish bishops feared most, a secular ruler who bowed to no cross. Bishop Arnulf, a former nobleman turned cleric, had served in Brunhilda's courts early in his career. He had witnessed firsthand her political maneuvering, her manipulation of kings, and her disregard for religious boundaries. Though he owed his early advancement to her, he ultimately turned against her, perhaps out of conviction, perhaps out of calculation. As Clotaire II's power grew, Arnulf aligned with the Neustrian cause. He publicly condemned Brunhilda's tyranny and worked to legitimize Clotaire's eventual claim to rule over all the Frankish realms. Arnulf's sermons, letters, and influence among the noble class helped pave the way for Brunhilda's betrayal. To the people of Austrasia and Burgundy, the word of a bishop carried divine weight. When Arnulf framed Brunhilda's long regency as blasphemous, a rebellion not just against kings, but against God, it sealed her fate in the minds of many. And so, when Warnachar and the other nobles opened their gates to Clotaire II, they were not merely making a political choice. They were responding to a theological mandate. The queen, they were told, had become a heretic, a dangerous woman whose presence invited divine punishment on the realm. This religious condemnation gave Clotaire's brutality a sacred veneer. Brunhilda wasn't just a political enemy anymore. She was a corrupter of kings, a Jezebel, a destroyer of Christian order. The bishop and the boar, Arnulf and Clotaire, had united not simply to reclaim the crown, but to purify the realm. When Clotaire finally captured Brunhilda in 613, his first move was not military, but ceremonial. He sought Arnulf's blessing. The church, after all, needed to sanctify his actions to make them legitimate. Arnulf, ever the careful strategist, gave it, and with it came silence from the pulpit, even as the queen was tortured and killed. No bishop spoke on her behalf. No priest objected to her death. This was the final act in a long campaign to erase Brunhilda's power, to destroy not just her body, but her authority, her memory, and her moral right to rule. And yet, in an ironic twist of history, Bishop Arnulf's own bloodline would come to be entwined with royal power in the centuries that followed. His descendants would eventually form the Carolingian dynasty, most notably producing Charlemagne, the great unifier of Europe. Thus, the man who had helped destroy Brunhilda, the last powerful queen of the Merovingians, would see his bloodline rise to eclipse hers. It was poetic, it was tragic, and it was exactly the kind of quiet, generational conquest that Brunhilda had spent her life trying to prevent. Even in death, she would have seen it. The queen was gone, her body mutilated, her name slandered, her dynasty exterminated. But her enemies had only just begun to rewrite the story. The boar had triumphed. The bishop had blessed it. But the legend, that would not be so easily buried. The morning sky was gray over the camp at Autun, where Brunhilda, once queen of Austrasian Burgundy, was held captive. The ropes binding her wrists had chafed her skin raw. Her hair, once woven with gold, now hung in matted coils over her shoulders. Mud clung to the hem of her garments, or what remained of them. She was no longer seen as a ruler. She was a prisoner, a pariah, a woman stripped of all dignity. And the crowd, they watched. Clotaire, too, had ordered her displayed before the people not as a criminal, but as a cautionary tale. The queen who ruled too long. The woman who dared to command men. The architect of bloodlines, now standing alone, reduced to dust and whispers. Brunhilda's capture marked more than the collapse of a political career. It was the violent rupture of a long and calculated life. For over 4 decades, she had held power across 3 Frankish kingdoms. She had guided monarchs, crushed rebellion, survived betrayal. But even the strongest blade wears down over time, and hers had finally broken under the weight of years and enemies. Her final fall was swift, but not without pain. After the deaths of her grandsons and great-grandsons, she had tried to reassert control one last time by installing young Sigebert II on the throne. But the nobles, weary and enraged, had no interest in a child king, and even less in Brunhilda's continued regency. They conspired with Clotaire, the last surviving son of Fredegund, and delivered both the boy and his great-grandmother into the hands of their enemies. Sigebert II was the first to die. He was just a child, no threat to anyone save for the blood that flowed in his veins. That blood was Merovingian, but more damning, it was Brunhilda's. There was no trial, no delay. He was cut down, along with his young brothers, on Clotaire's command. Brunhilda, however, was not so fortunate. Or perhaps she was far more unfortunate. Her enemies wanted more than death. They wanted humiliation, and they wanted the people to see it. She was led in chains through the towns of Burgundy. Some onlookers jeered. Others stood silently, perhaps remembering her strength in younger years. She had built roads, founded monasteries, reformed law, and expanded literacy. But such achievements were now buried under the weight of war and resentment. Rumors followed her. She had bewitched kings. She had killed her own kin. She had married her stepson. She had poisoned bishops and executed innocent nobles. The list grew with each passing day, each story darker than the last. At one stop, she was dragged from her litter and thrown into the mud by soldiers. They forced her to kneel before a crowd of peasants, many of whom spat on her, pelted her with rotting food, and mocked her name. The soldiers laughed, and the priest said nothing. She was alone, but she did not cry. Witnesses, even those who hated her, later noted her silence, her composure. She did not wail. She did not plead. She stared straight ahead, even as her body trembled from cold and exhaustion. There was no regalia, no retinue, no crown. But the queen in her soul remained. In Clotaire's court, her trial began. It was a formality, not a search for justice, but performance to justify a brutal execution. She was accused of murdering 10 kings, of corrupting youth, of treason, of heresy, of consorting with demons. The charges, absurd in their scope, were never meant to be proven. They were only meant to shape her legacy. She offered no defense. Perhaps she knew no words would save her. Or perhaps she understood that history itself had already begun turning against her. But even in this mockery of law, there was fear, not from her, but from those who condemned her. Because power, once held so long and so fiercely, leaves a ghost. And Brunhilda's ghost will haunt the minds of kings and chroniclers for centuries. When the verdict was read, there was no surprise. Execution. But the method, that was Clotaire's invention. It would be cruel, spectacular. It would serve as a message to any woman or man who dared to overstep their place. Some claimed she was bound by hair and limbs to wild horses, her body torn in every direction until it came apart like parchment. Others claimed something darker, that she was cast into a pit of starving pigs, her body slowly consumed by snouts and tusks, her screams drowned beneath the squeals of the swine. Whether literal or metaphor, the message was clear. Brunhilda would not simply die. She would be erased. The queen who once ruled 3 realms now stood before her end, not as a monarch, but as meat, prepared to the spectacle of a country that needed to forget her greatness. And as the ropes were tightened and the executioners drew near, history took a breath, because this was not the death of a queen. It was the murder of a legend. The sentence passed upon Queen Brunhilda was not born out of justice, nor even vengeance. It was born a spectacle. Clotaire, too, now ruler of all 3 Frankish kingdoms, understood the power of narrative. To slay a queen was not enough. He had to unmake her, body and myth alike, in a fashion so horrific it would burn itself into the minds of those who witnessed it, and echo through generations as a cautionary tale. The chronicles record multiple versions of her death, each one more brutal than the last. Some say she was tied to wild horses, each limb fastened to a different beast, and torn apart in the central square of her neve, her flesh pulled until it snapped. Others tell a more grotesque fate. Thrown alive into a pit of ravenous pigs, her body consumed while still breathing. These accounts differ in detail, but not in message. Her end was to be a degradation of the highest order. A queen who dared to rule, who defied kings, clergy, and custom alike, would be brought low in a manner once reserved for witches, heretics, and enemies of the state. This was not merely execution. This was erasure. On the morning of her death, Brunhilda was led through the camp, surrounded by Clotaire soldiers. Some whispered prayers. Others looked away, too haunted by what they were about to see. In the eyes of many, she was already a ghost, her figure skeletal, her voice gone hoarse from weeks of captivity, her legacy already poisoned. She said nothing. She was brought before a crowd gathered near the banks of the Saône River. The executioners awaited orders, ropes and whips in hand. The pigs, if they were there, were penned at the edge of a trench dug into the earth, snarling and pacing, their bodies gaunt with hunger. Was it literal? Was it symbolic? That is the great mystery of Brunhilda's death. In one telling, she was bound by hair, arms, and ankles tied to 4 wild horses. When they were lashed into motion, the animals tore her body apart, dragging her bloody remains through the mud while the onlookers gasped and crossed themselves. In another, she was stripped bare and tossed into a pit of swine. The pigs, driven to madness by hunger, lunged at her, ripping skin from bone as she screamed. The crowd, unable to watch, turned away, and Clotaire, his revenge finally complete, is said to have smiled. But neither version is certain. The written histories of the 7th century were not neutral. They were penned by men loyal to Clotaire, men who hated Brunhilda, feared powerful women, and viewed her long reign as unnatural. These chroniclers may have embellished, exaggerated, or invented details to shame her memory. Yet the details persisted, passed from monk to monk, scroll to scroll, echoing through the halls of monasteries and into the mouths of commoners. And the story stuck, the queen devoured by pigs. Whether it happened or not, the image became real in the minds of people. Because what mattered most was not the truth of her death. but what it said about her life. To Clotaire and his court, Brunhilda represented the chaos of womanly rule, a disruption of the natural order. Her execution was, in their eyes, a purification, a cleansing of the sin that had sat too long on the Frankish throne. And so, they turned her into a parable. A woman who lived like a king would die like a beast. But history is not so easily tamed. Despite their efforts, Brunhilda's story did not vanish. It endured in whispered legends, in poems, in stained-glass depictions twisted by church bias. And centuries later, historians would begin to ask, was she really the monster they claimed? Or was she a powerful woman destroyed by the world she tried to lead? Her death, so violently symbolic, became a mirror. In it, we see the fear of patriarchy, the brutality of unchecked power, and the fate of those who stand too long in the light of history. No tomb holds her bones. No statue honors her reign. But her ghost still lingers, drifting between pages and ruins, among the ashes of 3 kingdoms and the echoes of a scream no one recorded. Clotaire thought he had destroyed her, but in giving her a death so gruesome, so unforgettable, he ensured she would never be forgotten. The pigs were not just executioners. They were witnesses. And we, centuries later, still bear their tale. The wind that swept through the Frankish countryside that day carried more than dust. It carried dread. Soldiers gathered in grim silence. Villagers pressed close to one another, and priests stood with their eyes lowered. Everyone knew what they had come to witness. It was not justice. It was annihilation. Queen Brunhilda, the woman who had ruled for nearly half a century, whose command once shaped kingdoms, was to die, not in secret, not by sword or poison, but in the dirt, before the eyes of her enemies, and in a fashion designed to erase her not only from life, but from legacy. The execution took place near the town of Reneve, at a clearing by the river's edge. Some accounts claim a large crowd assembled there, nobles, peasants, soldiers, and clerics, drawn by the promise of spectacle. Others say it was more private, attended only by loyal executioners and a few high-ranking officials. Either way, the event was burned into memory. Brunhilda was dragged out, bound in chains. Her body bore the marks of imprisonment. Bruises, wounds, and weight loss had made her nearly unrecognizable. Yet despite her condition, those present said she held her head high. Her eyes were clear, unflinching. She had seen too many courts to be afraid of one more. She had sent too many men to their deaths to flinch at her own. But this was not to be a clean execution. This was Clotaire's moment of retribution, and he wanted it savage. She was accused once more, not by trial, but by declaration. 10 kings' deaths laid at her feet. The corruption of youth, treason, blasphemy, witchcraft, none of it formally proven, none of it contested. The accusation served not to convict her, but to justify what was about to happen. Then came the method. Wild horses, restless and snorting, were led into the clearing. Brunhilda was tied to them. Some say by her arms and legs, others say by her hair and limbs, each bound to a separate animal. With a signal, the handlers cracked their whips, and the horses lunged in opposite directions. Her body was torn, not at once, but gradually, grotesquely, as joints dislocated, skin ripped, and bones cracked. The crowd watched in stunned silence, the air filled with the sound of hooves, creaking ropes, and something far more primal, the sound of a legacy being destroyed. In some versions, the execution did not stop there. The torn remains of the queen were tossed into a pit or fed to pigs waiting nearby, their snouts red with filth and frenzy. Whether this was embellishment or fact is unclear, but the imagery remains, soaked in the cruelty of an era that valued symbols more than mercy. Clotaire, too, did not attend the execution in person, but he received reports. He had waited decades for this moment. The complete and total fall of Brunhilda. She had outlived his mother. She had ruled more kingdoms than he ever had. And for much of his life, she had been the storm he could not stop. But now, she was gone, reduced to blood in the dirt. The message was sent, not only to the nobles who once supported her, but to the entire Frankish world. This was what happened to those who defied the order of kings. This was the fate of women who tried to rule as men. Clotaire, now undisputed king of the Franks, moved quickly to erase her influence. He had her great-grandchildren murdered, her records destroyed, her policies reversed. The monasteries she funded were seized. The bishops she appointed were exiled or replaced. Within a year, it was as if Brunhilda had never ruled. And yet, she was not forgotten. Even in death, her story lingered. Her name was cursed from pulpits and vilified in chronicles, but remained. No matter how monstrous the tales became, no matter how embellished the stories of her death, they ensured her legacy would endure. In attempting to destroy her memory, Clotaire had made it indelible. The execution of Brunhilda was meant to serve as a final chapter. Instead, it became a legend, horrific, grotesque, unforgettable. A warning, yes, but also, in time, a question. Was she truly the monster history claimed? Or was she the victim of a world that could not bear to see a woman hold power for so long? In that field by the river, where blood soaked the earth and silence followed the screams, one queen died, but the myth she became would live for centuries. And somewhere beneath the dirt, beneath the hoofprints, beneath the whispers, her story still waits. When Brunhilda's mutilated body was discarded and her bones left to decay, her enemies believed they had finished the story. But what followed was even more insidious than her torture. It was a slow, calculated rewriting of her life. A legacy not buried, but poisoned. For the next several centuries, her name would appear in texts not as a ruler, reformer, or queen, but as a symbol of corruption, witchcraft, and female ambition gone mad. This was no accident. It was erasure by design. The early medieval chroniclers, almost exclusively monks and churchmen, had little love for strong women in power, and even less for one who had defied both secular and ecclesiastical control for over 4 decades. Brunhilda had removed bishops, appointed priests, influenced church doctrine, and refused to be a puppet of the clergy. She did not ask for permission. She acted, and in doing so, she earned the hatred of the very men who had come to write her story. The most famous chronicler of her time, Fredegar, offered one of the earliest surviving narratives of her life, and it was far from flattering. He painted Brunhilda as a scheming Jezebel, a woman responsible for the deaths of kings and the ruin of kingdoms. His account linked her with dark superstitions, portraying her as a manipulator who led young monarchs to ruin. According to Fredegar, she murdered 10 kings. The number is absurd, but the goal was clear: make her monstrous. Other writers followed suit. Later, Frankish and Carolingian chroniclers repeated these accusations, often adding new layers of scandal. Brunhilda, they claimed, had taken lovers, poisoned rivals, and corrupted her grandchildren. Some even alleged she had an incestuous relationship with her stepson. These claims were almost certainly fabrications, or distortions of court politics twisted into salacious rumor. But facts were not the goal. Moral instruction was. And Brunhilda became the ultimate cautionary tale. To the medieval mind, her story served a dual purpose. First, as a warning against female power, a woman who seeks to rule will bring death. Second, as a tool of political legitimacy. By painting Brunhilda as evil, Clotaire II's brutal consolidation of power and his public murder of a queen could be justified. The ends, they argued, had cleansed the realm. But buried beneath the slander lies a different figure, one now being rediscovered by historians. Brunhilda was no mere villain. She was a powerful queen in a brutal world. A Visigothic princess educated in Roman law and culture, she brought administrative reforms to the Frankish kingdoms. She strengthened the roads and infrastructure, supported monastic communities, and enforced laws that had decayed after the fall of Rome. Her court was one of the most literate in the early Middle Ages, and she was among the first rulers in Europe to build a state around written law and structured governance. In other words, she ruled like a Roman, but this was a Frankish world, tribal, patriarchal, and unstable. A woman attempting to centralize power and enforce written law was alien to the nobles, threatening to the bishops, and intolerable to rival kings. So she was recast, not as a queen, but as a witch, not as a leader, but as a usurper. For centuries, that version of Brunhilda prevailed. Students of medieval history encountered her name only in the margins of tales about Fredegund, Clotaire, or the rise of the Carolingians. When she was mentioned, it was in whispers, the evil woman who ruled too long. But beginning in the 20th century, a reassessment began, with new methods of historiography and an interest in women's roles in early medieval governance. Scholars began re-examining the original documents and questioning the motives of the chroniclers. Was Brunhilda truly more ruthless than the men she ruled beside, or merely more visible? After all, her male contemporaries, Clotaire, Chilperic, and Fredegund, had all committed comparable or worse crimes. They had murdered siblings, betrayed allies, and burned towns. But only Brunhilda was dragged through the mud, literally and figuratively. Today, her story is no longer seen as just a tale of ambition and downfall, but as a revealing mirror of early medieval gender politics. Her rise shows how a woman could wield immense power through intellect and royal blood. Her fall shows how quickly that power could be condemned as unnatural. And her death, brutal, excessive, unforgettable, became the punctuation mark at the end of a carefully rewritten sentence. But history is not so easily controlled. Brunhilda has emerged again, not as a footnote, but as a figure worthy of reflection. Her story reminds us how easily the line between truth and narrative can be blurred, how legends are formed not by what people did, but by who survived to tell the tale. And in that telling, Brunhilda was made a monster. But now, we begin to see the queen beneath the mask. In the long, blood-drenched tapestry of European history, the name Brunhilda remains an anomaly. Her life reads like a Greek tragedy. Born a princess, married into power, elevated by death, and ultimately destroyed by those who could not control her. But unlike so many queens whose stories end with veiled exit into obscurity, Brunhilda's legacy casts a long and complex shadow, one that still haunts history. More than 13 centuries have passed since her execution, and yet the image of her death, bound to horses or devoured by pigs, continues to echo in books, films, podcasts, and historical debates. Why? Why does this woman, more than any other queen of early medieval Europe, endure in such visceral, disturbing detail? Because she was not just a ruler. She was a disruption. Brunhilda broke every mold of her time. In an age when women were expected to influence in the shadows, through sons, marriage alliances, and piety, she stood at the forefront. She made war. She appointed bishops. She governed directly. She challenged kings. She ruled in her own name. She dared to do what only men were allowed to do. And she did it better than most. And that, more than anything, made her dangerous. The narrative that followed her death was not just about personal vengeance. It was about control. The chroniclers and kings who demonized her weren't merely recounting a fall from power. They were redefining the rules. They wanted to ensure that no woman would ever again wield the sword of state with such independence. But their plan failed. Not because another Brunhilda immediately took her place. She was, in many ways, the last of her kind. But because the story they crafted was too grotesque, too memorable, too tragic to fade. The pigs, the ropes, the torn limbs. These weren't just punishments. They were symbols. And symbols endure. In the centuries that followed, European queens would rise and fall, but few would dare to command power so directly again into the likes of Isabella of Castile, Catherine Medici, or Elizabeth I. And each of them, in their own time, would be accused of many of the same things: poison, witchcraft, seduction, tyranny. In that way, Brunhilda became not just a queen, but a prototype, the original woman too strong to survive unpunished. Today, historians are acclaiming her story, not as apologists, but as truth seekers. They're peeling back the layers of slander and myth to examine the real woman beneath, a Visigothic noblewoman educated in Roman law, a queen who rebuilt shattered kingdoms, a grandmother who fought for her lineage, and yes, a ruler who made deadly mistakes in a ruthless age. Brunhilda was no saint, but she was also not the sorceress history claimed. She was, in every sense, a product of her time, and perhaps even a century ahead of it. Her story speaks to something deeper than mere history. It touches on universal themes: the fear of powerful women, the manipulation of legacy, the fragility of truth in the hands of those who write it. She reminds us that history is often not about what happened, but about what was allowed to be remembered. And what was remembered about Brunhilda? That she died screaming, that she was torn apart, that she was a villain. But maybe now, finally, we can remember something else. That she ruled. That she survived for decades in a world that wanted her dead. That she dared to lead when others hid behind crowns. And that for all their attempts to erase her, her name still makes us ask, what really happened? And who got to decide? In that, Brunhilda wins. Because no matter how gruesome her fate, no matter how twisted the tales became, she is still here. Not as a victim, but as a force. A queen whose shadow still falls across the pages of time, daring us to look again, to question again, and to never take history at face value. Because behind every accusation lies a motive, behind every villain, a story, and behind Brunhilda's bloodied crown, a truth still waiting to be uncovered. Like history that bites back? Subscribe to the Crit Stories for more deep dives into dark history, brutal betrayals, and the secrets they tried to bury. Leave a comment. Was Brunhilda a monster or the last true queen of her time? Hit the bell so you never miss a legend soaked in blood.